I really appreciate it. And the mic is yours.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Gabri, for making this happen, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own personal story, how I came to do the work that I do, what it is I do, what are my experiences in the intellectual spaces, how to respond or understand the deeper ideas that are going on in those spaces, and then we can kind of go through a Q&A session in general, or also if there have been any comments that were told to you against Israel, against Jewish identity, you can bring them up, and I can break down where those comments even come from and how to address them. So my story actually starts not too far from England. It starts in France. That's where I was born. My mother's side of the family came from Morocco and Algeria. They were kicked out in 1948 of a community called Oujda. There was a massacre of the Jewish community there following the creation of Israel as a sort of retaliation, and they left to France shortly after. My father's side of the family was born in Poland and in Belgium and left to France during the Holocaust and hid in attics to survive the war. And that's how both of my parents were first generation born in France. When I was 3 after being born there, my family moved to Israel. After 2 years, they realized it wasn't so easy to make money in Israel, so they decided to move to America for 5 years. 5 years became 10 years, became 15 years, and they stayed most of my childhood in the US. And particularly growing up in Miami, which is a very different community and place, unlike other places in the US, people don't really identify as American. They really identify as Argentinian, Venezuelan, Colombian, Haitian, Jamaican, and even in the Jewish community, I went to modern Orthodox Jewish day school until high school, and we had the Maccabi games, and these Jews really identified with Argentina, with Peru, with Colombia, with Brazil. And to me, it was always kind of strange that people identified with those countries because I had always rejected Morocco because my family was not Moroccan in Morocco. They were killed for being Jews. And I rejected Poland because my family was not Polish in Poland. They were killed for being Jews and not Polish. So I had a sense of rejecting identities that are just experiences that we had in the diaspora. And growing up in Miami, I was always labeled the French kid. And when I'd visit family in France, I was the American cousin. And my father's side is Ashkenazi, and my mother's side is Sfaradi. But because of the Holocaust, my dad wasn't transmitted any sort of Ashkenazi culture. He was raised as a proud Jew, but no keeping Shabbat, no keeping kosher, nothing beyond just the identity of being a Jew. So when he married my mother, who was more traditional, he accepted her Sephardic customs. So I was raised fully Sephardic. But going to a Jewish day school, they asked me, "Oh, what's your last name? Rochman? Okay, so you must be Ashkenazi. Your father's Ashkenazi, right? Yes. So you're Ashkenazi." And it's like, oh, yeah, I get it that usually the father is what transmits being Ashkenazi or not. But in my situation, my dad accepted the Sephardic customs because he did not have any of his own. And I was raised Sephardic, so don't tell me who I am. And the question of identity came up very early because whenever someone would ask me, "Where are you from?" or "Who are you?" I was supposed to give a different answer depending on who is asking me that question or where that question was being asked. So right away I had a sort of identity crisis, not in the sense of not knowing who I am, but not knowing how to respond to people's questions or impositions of identity onto myself. And at the age of 7, everything changed for me. I took a trip to London actually with my mom and my younger brother. We got ready to get on the red double-decker tour bus that does the tour of London. My mom was wearing a shirt in Hebrew that actually she bought from Tzfat and said Emet, which if anyone's in tune with Kabbalah and how letters can impact people, I think the fact that Emet was written played a huge role in what happened after. And the bus driver, who was a Nazi, noticed did someone try to say something? No, okay. So
No.
the bus driver that ended up being a neo-Nazi saw my mother's shirt and asked her, "Excuse me, is that written in Jewish?" And she said, "No, it's written in Hebrew, but it's the language of the Jewish people, if that's what you're asking." He's like, "Oh, so you guys are Jews?" She's like, "Yeah, we're Jews. That's the problem." And he said, "I don't want any Jews on my bus. You have to get off." Said, "I don't know who you think you are. We're not getting off the bus." And he got up, grabbed my mom, and threw her off. And when that happened, everything changed for me because I did not know how to respond. I did not know how to react. People got involved. The guy ended up getting arrested. And in that moment, 2 things happened. The first is it taught me who I was. because I realized it didn't matter where I was born, grew up, lived in, traveled to, resided in, what passport I had, or what I believed in or didn't believe in. I believe in Hashem. I believe in the Torah. Put tefillin every morning. Never haven't kept kosher. Never didn't do a fast since the age of 7, including the fast of the firstborn. And I know there are ways to get out of it, but I want to do it anyways. So I'm very connected to my culture. But I noticed that that person didn't even ask me if I ma'amin be'Elohim or not, or ma'amin b'Torah. He didn't care. He cared that we were Jews. So in that one moment, I realized that it didn't matter all this experience that I had externally of my homeland and identity, of being born in France, being raised in the US, having experiences of my family in Morocco and being Sephardic, or having experiences of my family in Poland and being Ashkenazi. What mattered was that I was a Jew. So then I started asking myself the question, what does it mean to be a Jew? Because we're told often today that we're a religion, but when the Jewish people say that we're a religion, it's different than when the rest of the world uses the word religion, because the rest of the world defines it as a belief system in a God, deity, book, or prophet. So only a belief system for any people. Whereas when you look at Judaism, it's way more than only a belief system, and it isn't for any people, it is for one people. So what do I mean by that? If you look at any actual example of religions, you look at Christianity, you look at Islam, you look at Buddhism. If you don't believe in Jesus, you're not a Christian. If you don't believe in Muhammad, you're not a Muslim. If you don't believe in the teachings and the philosophy of Buddha, you're not a Buddhist. And to become a Christian or Muslim or Buddhist, all you need to do is accept Jesus, you're a Christian. Accept Muhammad, you're a Muslim. Accept the philosophies of Buddha, you're a Buddhist. Let's apply the same standard to Judaism. If one were to reject the Torah and Hashem, does that make them any less of a Jew? No. They're just as equally a Jew. They may be unobservant, they may be disconnected, but they're still Jewish. And if someone comes off the street and says, I accept Torah, does that make them a Jew? Also no. They'd have to go through years of a process of adopting an identity, a history, a culture, a connection to Hashem, a connection to a land, a purpose in this world, the suffering that comes along with being a Jew. You'd be going through a process of going into and becoming a part of a civilization, a nation, a people, a history, and a future. And so, in my opinion, this word religion doesn't do justice to what Judaism is, because religions don't have rights to lands. Peoples do, nations do, collectives and civilizations do. And so I think in my way of trying to describe what Judaism is, it's sort of the portable suitcase that we developed when we left Judea, creating Judaism. And ism at the end of the word is a man-made structure. So Zionism, feminism, capitalism, communism, whatever structure it is, good or bad, it's a man-made social structure. So we created Judaism in order to, within this suitcase, pack in our identity, our culture, our history, our Torah, our values, our language, our connection to Yerushalayim, our connection to Eretz Israel, the purpose of our people, everything inside. And we pass this down ledor vador, generation to generation, with the aspiration of Shana B'Yerushalayim, one day coming back home and reviving the civilization. And so I realized then that being a Jew wasn't my secondary religion, but was my primary and sole identity. And that being a Jew was a synonym for being an Israelite, for being a Hebrew, for being Am Yisrael, for being Bnei Yisrael. In fact, in the Torah, there's no mention of Yehudim, and there's no mention of Yehadut. There's either Am Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, or Ivreim that we're called. So to be a Jew is a synonym for the same nation and the same people. And even more so, I'm actually from the tribe of Levi from both sides of my family. My dad is a Levi and my mom is a Kohen, which is a sub-tribe of Levi. So why am I even called a Jew if I'm not from the tribe of Judah? It's because we're all called Jews today, because the last name of our civilization, when it was colonized by the Roman Empire, was called Judea. Hence, coming from Judea, becoming known as Judeans, Judin, Yudin, Jews, whatever it is, and also creating this portable suitcase of our identity called Judaism. So in that moment, it made me realize who I was and how I could explain it and better understand it. And the second thing that it did for me is it made me promise that the next time I'd see any form of injustice, especially anti-Semitism, I'd be prepared. I'd be prepared physically, I'd be prepared intellectually, I'd be prepared psychologically and emotionally, and I'd be prepared even ideologically, meaning understanding the greater ideas that was going on that caused this to happen in the first place, and what role I could play to make sure that this never happens again. After that experience, I went on a sort of evolution, and that was my awakening of making me an activist. Already in high school, I was throwing parties, raising money, and giving it all to FIDF. And when I finished high school, I joined the IDF. I served as a paratrooper in Israel as a Tzankan. And when I finished the army, I started school at UCLA. And UCLA in Los Angeles is not so pro-Israel, even though there's a lot of Jews living in Los Angeles. And this was in 2013 when I first started to experience the anti-Israel movement. And I call it the anti-Israel movement and not the pro-Palestinian movement, because when it comes to Palestinians dying by the thousands in Syria, we don't hear anything. When it comes to the Palestinians in suffering by the hundreds of thousands of refugee camps in Lebanon or in Jordan, we don't talk about them. When it comes to Palestinians suffering on the border of Gaza in Egypt, we don't talk about them. They were only using the suffering of select Palestinians when it fit their narrative, taking everything out of context in order to push a political agenda of demonizing and delegitimizing the Jewish people's right to exist and the Jewish people's claim to a homeland. And the way that they would use this strategy is by using something called intersectionality. Now, the concept of intersectionality in a political or intellectual space is this idea that minority movements are suffering from some sort of oppressive system, be it a white system, be it a capitalist system, whatever it is that people are talking about today. And in order for those minorities that are targeted or suffering, they have to unite in order to fight the power. So in theory, let's say there was this force that was forcing minorities to suffer. If Jews, blacks, women, LGBTQ plus, all sorts of different minority groups that exist today were to unite, obviously they'd be stronger in numbers. So that's the theory of intersectionality, of how the structure exists and how to be able to fight that structure and make it better. However, the way that these students that are anti-Israel, that are communicating and using intersectionality, is very similar to how the formula of anti-Semitism has always functioned. Find the source of suffering of a community or an experience and find a way to blame all of that on the Jewish people. So they would go to every single minority group on the college campus, the black students, the LGBTQ+, the Native Americans, the Hispanics, the women, literally every single minority group, and convince them that either their suffering was linked and is the same that Israel is doing to the Palestinians, or even Israel is responsible for their suffering itself, or the Jews are responsible for their suffering. So, for example, they'd go to the Black Student Association and say, oh, you suffer from police brutality and racism? Well, we suffer from IDF brutality and Israeli racism. And actually, the IDF and the Jews are training the New York State Police Department to kill Black people. And you think about that, and it's like, how could anyone logically even accept that reality? But anti-Semitism has never been spread by saying the truth or something logical. And the way that they even explain this, if you ask them to dive deeper, is because there was one time this Kav Maga instructor that was like 40 something years old. So he had been out of the IDF for 20 something years. And he was a private Kav Maga instructor that gave one precinct in New York City a class on self-defense. And because of that, somehow that guy was in the IDF 20 something years ago. That's connected to the IDF. IDF connected to Israel. Israel's connected to the police. Police are bad. Israel's bad. Let's make that connection. And that's how they're spreading their ideas. They're convincing the next generation. And the reason for why a college campus is so important is because they represent the next generation political and intellectual class. Those coming out of college campuses will eventually become those that are shifting pop culture, those in the media, those in politics, those in medicine, those in law. And if those coming out of this campus structure and sort of plant that puts ideas into people's minds and puts them out into the reality, the future for our people is going to look very bad as anti-Semitism is rising, is clearly a case of what is going on. So they're building all these coalitions, convincing everyone that the source of their problems is the Jews and Israel. And so, okay, that's what's going on. That's their strategy. That's what they're doing. And so I started to look within. What is our side doing? What are the Jewish people doing to combat anti-Semitism? What are we doing to claim our narrative? I mean, you wouldn't want to hear about Black rights from KKK members or women rights from misogynists. So why are the only people talking about Jewish rights in Israel those that are anti-Jewish and anti-Israel? Why aren't we narrating our own story in a way that actually works and speaking out and not being afraid? What is going on here? And the response I got in 2013 from rabbis and Jewish leaders and organizations and student groups and all the like structure, and I would say those that are like the Jewish professionals in this industry of Jewish professionalism and all these organizations, their response was basically, don't do anything. If you do something, it'll get worse. What we need to do is go from the top down rather than from the bottom up, which clearly has been a strategy that has always failed us throughout history. And as I was hearing all these things, it kind of reminded me something that I had learned when I did martial living. And for anyone who hasn't done the trip in Poland for martial living, I definitely recommend everyone to do it. And there are many different responses, emotional, psychological, that people have when going on a trip. And for me, it was not the idea that 6 million Jews were massacred and murdered, because my entire family on my father's side were massacred. My grandfather was the only one who survived. So it's not what happened, but it's how it happened. And what I mean by how it happened, it's not actually like the act of killing Jews, it's the evolution of a society being healthy and fine with their Jewish population, and within a decade, burning Jews alive. And so the way that they were able to teach us how it happened is they gave us a packet, and in this packet, there was a list of letters being written by Jewish presidents and community leaders and rabbis, addressing and talking about the rise of anti-Semitism across Europe and what they should do about it. And when I read it, I was basically, reminded of exactly the same thing that was written there when I was hearing the answers of the Jewish community. They said, don't do anything about it. If you do something, it'll just get worse. Many Jews even said, we actually have to support Hitler, because although Hitler wrote something in Mein Kampf that is anti-Semitic, anyways, he's going to be in a position of power. So we have to support him financially, so at least we have a connection with him. And that has been the mentality and the approach dealing with anti-Semitism for the past 2,000 years. Let's put our heads down and let's side with the oppressive force or the power in order for them to do something about it, and not even deal with the culture shifting. And if we don't recognize that when the culture shifts, eventually those future politicians and leaders are coming out of that culture, and even if those future politicians aren't necessarily right away going to be those in those positions, those in those positions have to get elected. So obviously they have to take positions that is popular within what is growing and what is becoming more popular. So this strategy of only doing it from the top down rather than from the bottom up is what has failed us for so many years. And after a year of realizing this and realizing what was going on, and not that they were so strong, but that we were so weak, I decided to take a year off to backpack Asia like a good Israelite with the army, with my friends. And already when I was there, I knew that when I wanted to come back, I wanted to go to the hardest place that you can go to, against Israel and against the Jewish people. And I wanted to go there on purpose to prove a point that there should be no more excuses as to why you can't, or it's too hard, or I'm not going to send my child to this school, it's too anti-Semitic. I'm not going to send my child to that school, it's too anti-Israel. It's like, no, Dafka, that's exactly where we need to be. Because if we're not there, no one is there for us. If we're not standing up, no one is standing up for us. And we have not been prepared or conditioned. I spoke earlier with Israel, that if you look on the college campus today, at least in America, for example, where you go back 80 years ago, let's take a very liberal campus like Columbia University. 80 years ago, it would have been accepted to talk about how civil rights may not be the right thing to do for Black people, because that was around the time where that conversation was relevant. Today, if someone talks about not giving equal rights to Black people, right away ostracized, there'd be a protest, there'd be a condemnation from the school, everyone would receive an email for how bad the student is. And most Black students are conditioned and prepared to deal with racism, and most other students are conditioned and prepared to recognize racism and to stand up against it. But what about when it comes to anti-Semitism? Are we conditioned and prepared to deal with anti-Semitism? Are we aware of the rhetoric and the counter narratives against our people? Are we even given the courage and taught the courage as Jews from a young age to go and to stand up and to risk getting a bad grade because it's worth it for our collective? And so this whole mentality of we need to stand down and we need to be afraid, I think is the reason for why we allow anti-Semitism to grow, because there will always be movements against any people, but it's up to that people to make sure that they don't grow. So growing up, I'd always go to France visiting family, and I'd always have my Magen David, and I refused to take it down. And my family members, even still to this day, when I go there, they say, "Well, don't you want to tuck it in? It's dangerous. They might, jump you. They might do something to you. They might hurt you." And I always refused to take it off or to hide it. And I didn't really know how to put words to it. But when I look at it today, I think that when you hide your Magen David, yes, you may be minimizing the risk of a potential attack, because maybe someone can't identify you as a Jew. Of course, unless they see that you have tzitzit or kippah or dress modestly, or they hear your name or whatever else it is. But for the most part, most people can pass off as non-Jews, so you'd be minimizing the risk of a potential attack. However, when you tuck in your Magen David, you're making it clear to the universe and to the world that you are accepting a reality that we should live being persecuted and hiding our identity. And when you do that, you're allowing the situation to get worse, which collectively is way more dangerous than it is for you as an individual. Because when it keeps growing on a collective level, that a situation becomes more and more anti-Semitic, a society becomes more and more okay with targeting Jews, at some point they will get you. And it doesn't matter how much money you have, how much political power you have, how much connections you have, they will come and get you. And it's only if we allow it to happen and to grow. And so we need to be on the front lines of changing that narrative and that way of thinking. So after a year of traveling and deciding to come back that I wanted to do this, I went on Google in 2016, and you guys can do this also, 2016 list of most anti-Semitic schools in North America. And Columbia University came up #1. So I decided that's where I'm going to transfer. And I don't want to hear anybody else ever giving an excuse as to you can't do it. And I started school over there as a transfer student, created a pro-Israel grassroots student movement that wasn't right-wing, left-wing, one state, two states. Our goal wasn't to push a political agenda onto a democratic country. Our goal was to be able to do three things: to empower, to educate, and to expose, in that order. The first is to empower. We need to be able to give the tools to Jews and allies. When it came to Black rights, it wasn't only Black people for fighting Black rights. When it came to women rights, it wasn't only women fighting for women rights. So when it comes to Jewish rights, it shouldn't only be Jews. Of course, we should do our own movement, but we should also create a space for allies. So we were empowering, giving the tools and the skills to be able to debate, to do public speaking, to understand counter narratives, to be able to create coalitions, to be able to narrate things in the right way for the pop culture and the generation to be in tune with what we're actually communicating. And these were tools that unfortunately should have been taught to us by our Jewish communities, day schools, parents, summer camps, all the Jewish institutions out there that, in my opinion, very much so succeeded in helping the Jews learn about a lot of things, but failed the Jews in the sense of how to be Jews in practice. We were taught about how to be Jews in theory and not in practice. And so we were seeking to empower. The second is to educate. Again, it's our responsibility to narrate our own story, but we have to do so in a language that actually communicates what we're trying to communicate to the audience. If I'm in England or in Australia or in America, everyone speaks English, so I can sell a product and come to another country that is an English speaking country and still be able to sell that product. But if I'm to go to France and I try to sell the product in English or in Chinese or whatever other language, then people will not be able to understand what I'm trying to say, even if I'm saying the same thing that needs to be said for them to understand. So I have to shift the language. And the problem in how we've been communicating the story of Israel and the story of the Jewish people is so in tune with the previous generation and so out of tune with the current generation. We talk about Israel and the Jewish people as, oh, a people that need a place of refuge, and we are the only democracy in the Middle East, and we created the cherry tomato, ways, drip irrigation, the pill that you swallow, that's a camera, and that's why we have a right to exist. The fundamental question today on a college campus to be able to handle and deal with anti-Semitism is, who are the Jewish people? And why does Israel have a right to exist? And none of those answers actually answers the question. We don't have a right to exist because we were persecuted. We could have gone somewhere else. That doesn't give us a right. We don't have the right to exist because we created some small tomatoes for a salad. We don't have a right to exist because we created an app that allows us to save traffic or avoid a ticket from a police officer. We don't have a right to exist because we're the only democracy in the Middle East, because there are many countries in the world that are not democracies and questioning their legitimacy. And if anything, I don't expect anything less of the Jewish people, but to have a democracy. If anything, I expect us to create something even better than a democracy, because clearly the systems don't work in Israel and don't work in many places in the world. So why are we answering the question with answers that don't actually answer the question, especially for younger generation, millennials and Gen Z, that care about something deeper? They don't care about just supporting because you in 1948 had the partition plan and the Balfour Declaration and won this war. Like, the generation really doesn't care about the facts. They care about the story and the legitimacy and the morality behind the story. So the way that we shifted the story of the Jewish people and their connection to Israel is, it's the story of Israel is the story of a 4,000-year-old native civilization from the land of Israel, Judea, that were physically and forcibly displaced by a Western white imperial called the Romans. And during their displacement, they still maintained a constant presence in their homeland. And after 2,000 years of extermination, persecution, and oppression, we created the most successful indigenous liberation movement that ever existed, where for the first time in history, a native people decolonized their land, revived their language, revived their civilization, and kicked off the oppressive force being the British. And when you talk about Israel in that language, you're saying the same thing, but you're giving the story and you're making someone understand, now I get who the Jewish people are. It's not just Russians that converted to Judaism. It's not just Argentinians that converted to Judaism. It's not just Moroccans that converted to Judaism. It's Jews that were displaced from the land and physically crossed over those borders. That's how they got there, not because they're from there. That's just an experience. I'm not from Morocco. I'm not from France. I'm not from America. I'm not from Spain before that. I'm not from Italy before that. I'm from Israel. And if us as Jews cannot say that this is where we're from, then how can we expect the world to understand that Israel is the home of the Jewish people if we ourselves, in our language and the way we project it, don't consider it home and don't communicate that to the world? Most people actually think that Jews are just this religion that spread and that people wherever they're living have converted to Judaism and that's how they became Jews. They don't understand that we're a collective that descends from a civilization. The last part of what we did on college campuses was to expose. It's our responsibility to go to every single group, whether far right, far left, because usually any form of extreme groups will always hate the Jews, and to be able to expose them for what they are, to show why their ideas are wrong, and to keep them in the shadows for where they belong. And we would go every single time that there was an anti-Israel event or anti-Jewish event. We would record them, we would challenge them, we would expose them, and slowly their numbers went down, and eventually their coalitions were broken, and we were able to start reclaiming the campus. What we were doing at Columbia eventually grew to across 50 different campuses, and then ideas just started growing completely to the next generation. And I went more into the space of creating content for a more macro level audience to change the way people understand who is a Jew, what is a Jew, why do we have a right to exist, and how to empower ourselves and fight against anti-Semitism. A year and a half ago, I made Aliyah officially, although in my mind, a long time ago, I made Aliyah. And I went to IDC. I did my master's there in MBA. I'm a part of a movement in Israel called Habayit that unites Israelis and Palestinians together. And the goal of our movement is to unite the activists from the younger generation for us to start engaging in conversation in figuring out how can we actually move forward together, because there's no future where Israelis disappear or Palestinians disappear. So I think a part of the next chapter of our story, I think the previous chapter, Zionism, which was the goal of returning to Zion, which we already achieved in 67. So now the question is, what's the next chapter of Jewish history that unites the ideological tribes that we've become, the left, the right, the religious, the secular, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, young and old, but also takes in consideration other populations that live there in order for us to create a reality that we actually achieve our aspirations and end the injustices that we all experience. And the only way that we can do that is actually from the ground up by the local representation and not the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, which doesn't represent their people and clearly are profiting from this conflict. So those are the things that I'm involved with. I'm also working right now on a project called We Were Never Lost, which is a documentary series on the stories, struggles, and aspirations of disconnected communities of Jews. Some people like to call them lost tribes. Some of them find that offensive because they to themselves were never lost. They may have been lost to us, but to them, they always knew who they were. And each season is going to be focused on a different region, starting with Africa, of reviving these stories, but also through telling their stories to change the way the world understands what is a Jew, who are we, where are we from, and why do we have a right to the aspirations that we have. So that's a bit about what I do. And we'll take some questions. And if you guys have ever heard any sort of anti-Semitic, anti-Israel thing being said to you, feel free to ask me how I would respond or what's the history behind how this even came to be.
Thank you so much. That was really, really amazing. If people want to put any questions in the chat or just unmute themselves and ask, this is your time. We'll wait a moment or two and then we'll begin asking the questions.
How do you react to a self-hating Jew?
It's a good question. First of all, I don't call them self-hating Jews. I think internalized anti-Semitism is a much better term because a lot of times it's very subconscious and they're not aware of what they're doing. And in order to understand the conclusions as to why someone becomes like that, I think an example in psychology where you have a woman, let's say, in a very abusive relationship where her husband is physically abusive towards that wife. And there are three ways basically in which a woman can react. She can fight back and remove herself from that situation, which is what anyone should be doing in that situation. She can make excuses for it and pretend that it's not a big deal. Oh, it was just one time. Oh, he didn't really mean it, which is unfortunately is a very common thing that people do when dealing with trauma. Or she can blame herself. No, it was actually my fault. I should have done this. I should have done that. I shouldn't have done this. I shouldn't have answered back. I should have cleaned there. And that is, I think, the most broken way to handle, but understandably that there's so much trauma that there's something that psychologically broke there that has to be helped and healed and fixed in order to end that trauma and the suffering. So when we look at the Jews that are anti their own people, we have to understand that there's so much generational trauma that our people have gone through, and there's so much anti-Semitism that exists today that we can't really judge them for subconsciously turning against their own collective. A lot of the times it's because they don't even know what it means to be a Jew, so they're not even connected. So why would they ever need the need to preserve it if they don't even know what it is or stand up for it? They go to college campuses and there's movements against the Jews, and if they want to be pro-Black rights and LGBTQ plus rights and women rights, they also have to be against Israel. So they just want to have a better life. There's a lot of misinformation out there that gets people to the wrong conclusions. I think there's a lack of understanding of what it means to be a Palestinian and what Palestinians have gone through within Jewish spaces that causes very smart and bright Jewish students to come to college campuses and find out that Palestinians are real human beings, and then reject sort of everything that they've been told because they felt that they've been lied to their whole lives and weren't given also the narrative of who Palestinians are. So I think there are many reasons for why someone becomes like that. Also, sometimes rebellion against parents, and if parents are very pro-Israel, they'll just do what their parents would make them mad. But however, whenever someone is like that, as a Jew, I think what we should be doing is going, reaching out to them, communicating to them, showing them why Judaism is beautiful, why it should be preserved, why being anti-Israel is actually something very problematic, why it's anti-Semitic, and actually helping them grow out of the phase that they're going through and help them along their path of their tikkun.
How do you respond to stereotypes about money?
So a lot of these stereotypes actually stem from very medieval periods within Europe, where the Jewish people were always kept in the middle in order to be pinned for the problems the top was doing to the bottom. And if you look at the history of the Jewish people in Europe, we were not allowed to participate in agrarianism, which is the form of commerce through agriculture, growing crops or cattle and trading it in a marketplace. We were not allowed to own land. We were not given equal rights. However, we were allowed to be the bankers. We were allowed to be the tax collectors. We were allowed to do a lot of things that have to do with sort of finance, and even being a tax collector. We're not collecting that tax for us. We're collecting the taxes for the king and queen. However, the people on the bottom that are being a lot of times unjustly taxed and suffering from that, who are they experiencing as the source of the suffering? They're experiencing the Jew as the source of the suffering, not the king and the queen. And that is the position that Jews have always played, especially in white societies, as always the scapegoat to what the top is doing to the bottom. And you see that on the right, that are, let's say, ultra capitalist and anti-communist. They'll blame all the Jews for being the communists. You see that on the extreme left. They'll blame all the Jews for being the capitalist. They'll see that on, white supremacists. If you go to them and ask them what is the number one enemy, you'll say Jews. If you go to black supremacists, like Black Hebrew Israelites, like Farrakhan's of the world, like all those types of people, they'll say the Jew is the problem. And whenever you go to the extremes, it's always the Jew is the problem. And there are many reasons for that. I think most people don't know who we are, and we haven't done a good job to express ourselves. I think there's a lot of jealousy where a lot of people see the success that the Jewish people have and feel jealous to it. However, I think it's explained by our culture. We help one another rise up. We value education. We value both parents in the house giving opportunities to the children and trying to work for them to go up. We're the only community that for history has always been literate and knowing how to read and write. It's a very new concept that people know how to read and write as part of pop culture, but Jews had to do bar and bar mitzvahs, and we were all literate. And not only literate, we had this machloket, and this rabbi said this, and we were taught to think critically and have diverse opinions. So our culture allowed us to develop and succeed. And that doesn't mean every Jew has gone through that, and that doesn't mean every non-Jew can't also succeed. But the reason for why we're like 0.1% of the world's population and have like 30% of the Nobel Peace Prizes and just some, the numbers don't make sense. There's something there. And I don't think it's because we're genetically born better or that we're somehow chosen. I think it's because we have a culture that empowers us to grow and to become better people as individuals, and one can choose to accept or reject that culture. So there's a lot of jealousy. There's a lot of people being blamed for our problems, but I think the more metaphysical, Kabbalistic answer, since this is a Jewish space, for why anti-Semitism exists is when we look at the mission statement of the Jewish people, what we accepted in Har Sinai, it wasn't only to preserve the mitzvot and be good Jews. It was also to do tikkun olam and ol hagoyim. Our people have a specific purpose that we chose, that we accepted to fulfill in this world. So if we look at the world as a body, and every nation, let's say, plays the role of an organ. They can play the role of one organ or two organs or half an organ. There's no like, you have to be this, you have to be this. What is the system or the organ that the Jewish people chose? We chose to be the immune system. Tikkun olam, to fix and heal the world, and to do olaguim, to empower the other organs to be able to function. So if our purpose in this world is to use Israel as a vessel to actually achieve tikkun olam and olaguim in order to get to this reality that we call Mashiach, where the world is fixed, and if we are not doing that, then there's a reason in my mind that subconsciously the world is rejecting and reacting to the Jewish people. It's not because we create all the problems, because I think deep down they understand that we have the ability and that we've taken the responsibility to change those world problems. And because we're not doing it, then we're being blamed for it. That's my only explanation logically of why it's always against the Jews, but there are other reasons as well. And I think the reasons for why this like money stuff comes, it's from ancient old anti-Semitism, that the Jews, we need to position them as the source of the problem within a society.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah. So my question is, it feels like with the generations now is that people are more susceptible to being easily offended, or people are more sensitive on certain topics than, let's say, older generations. So my question is, do you think that being easily offended, or this new thing of being more sensitive, is making it harder to have a conversation with two different people? So like bringing in a conversation of like a Jew and a Palestinian having a conversation, or an Israeli and a Palestinian, that sense of being easily offended or being sensitive to certain questions or conversations, making it harder.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of ways it's toxic to refuse to have conversations or to pick and choose intentionally how to feel offended in order to use that as some sort of political ammunition to fight against someone that may just have a different opinion. That being said, I do think that there's an importance in being sensitive to people's struggles and identities. And I think a lot of the older generation may have been a little bit too much insensitive. So a push to becoming more sensitive and speaking in a more appropriate and respectful way is important. But we also have to be open to having conversations and not intentionally finding offense in order to use that as some sort of capital to move you forward in the conversation. What I found very effective in order to have conversations with Palestinians is to speak in a very holistic language. So when I speak about the struggles of the Jewish people and our aspirations and what we've been through and what I want to see in the future, I also include Palestinians and their identity and their experiences in that rhetoric that allows them to understand that I'm not against them. Me being pro my people is not me being against your people. So I think we have to try to be as holistic as possible when we communicate and when we engage in order to allow a space for people to understand. And I think a lot of times when you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, oftentimes Palestinians have it right about them, but have it wrong about the Israelis. And many times Israelis have it right about them and wrong about the Israelis. And so wrong about the Palestinians. And so to be able to truly move forward, we have to create this, again, I'm saying again, holistic reality version of the truth that includes truths together, and that allows us to get a better picture and understanding of what happened. For example, in 1948, Palestinians often talk about the Nakba, that many Palestinians were displaced from their homes. This is a reality. Palestinians were displaced from their homes. That's the what. But they don't address the why. Why they were displaced from their homes. There was a series of attacks from both sides where Jews were displaced, Palestinians were displaced, and there was a war that broke out in 1948 where all of these communities that were displaced aligned themselves with those Arab armies in an attempt to actually destroy the Jewish people. That doesn't mean every single person in those communities did so, but clearly when you have a zero-sum game, one versus the other, there's going to be injustices that are created. So the why is because we were in a war and we were in a conflict of a zero-sum game, not because inherently the Jews needed Palestinians to leave or wanted Palestinians to leave, but because we're in the war. So I think a lot of Israelis don't understand the what happened to Palestinians, and I think a lot of Palestinians don't understand the what, that it also included Jews that were displaced, the Hebron massacres, Yishuv of Tel Chai and others, and don't address also the why it happened and the context behind it, and how certain forces, the British, kind of turned populations against each other, which is exactly what they did in Nigeria, in Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and India. Divide and conquer, divide the local populations and have them fight each other, rather than have them fight the power that is profiting from occupation and colonization of the British.
Okay.
Okay.
I have a question here. Sorry, first of all, thank you for giving the talk. It's you're doing an incredible work. It sounds like you're speaking. You alluded to the fact that you're speaking to what sounds like progressive, like-minded Palestinians, and I'm interested to know how you envisage that the current situation with them can be solved, and we can, live in peace with them. What type of solution do you hope for?
Sure. Right before this call, I got off of a 3-hour conversation with my friend Marwan on Clubhouse. For those of you who don't know, it's like this new app that allows people to listen to conversations and have rooms and have people ask questions. And we did a 3-hour conversation about being able to move forward, understanding how certain terms are harmful or being against certain terms are harmful, and all the conversations and questions that you may have about how to be able to move forward. And we constantly have these conversations. There's plenty of YouTube videos where I have debates with Palestinians that aren't really debates sometimes, that are just conversations about moving forward with individuals who value my identity as I value theirs. In Israel, like I said before, I'm a part of a grassroots movement called Habayit that unites Palestinians. We do something called cleaning the hate. We go to each other's communities, clean the pollution that exists on the lands, Jewish villages, build those relations. But I think what you're more so asking is, give me a practical solution that isn't a 1-state or 2-state that can work for us to be able to live together. Well, first of all, I think the approach of thinking that we need to come up with a solution and then apply it is a very Western approach, and an approach that clearly has failed the Middle East. I think it's great to come up with theories of what can be in order for us to break out of this 1-state, 2-state paradigm and maybe even inspire something to happen. But in order for us to get there, we have to start on a journey. And I am going to give you an example of a solution that can work. But first, I'm going to give you an analogy to explain how I think we should be looking at the situation. And it's an analogy that I think fits best to explain it. If I'm an artist, before I'm going to pick the frame that I want to use on the canvas and art piece that I created, I'm going to first pick what kind of frame what kind of canvas I want, what size, what texture, come up with an idea of what I want to paint, start painting, even pick my paintbrushes first and my colors first, and then start to paint, mess up, fix it. And only when I finish do I take a step back and say, you know what, on this painting, I need a thick wooden frame. Or on this painting, I need a thin metallic frame. And I could have originally thought that I wanted a thin metallic frame, but then when I step back, I realized that frame doesn't work at all. We need a thick wooden frame. So to talk about a solution right now is like talking about what kind of frame we're going to use on a painting that we haven't even discussed as artists, the Israelis and Palestinians, of what we want it to look like. So yes, I can go into a frame store and say, one day I would like to do this, one day, and maybe that will be. Maybe that will be the way that we'll go there, and maybe being in a frame store gives me even inspiration of coming up with this with a painting. So I'm all for coming up with great theories of what solutions can look like the one I'm going to break down soon. But we need to understand that it's a process and a journey that has to be taken from the ground up by both peoples. And in order to find whatever solution, it has to fulfill the aspirations of both people, which in my opinion do not contradict, and the injustices of both people, which ending them, in my opinion, doesn't contradict. Now, if you want a theory that exists, I suggest looking into the several different federation plans that exist, where it would be one civilization, where the experience of Israelis would be, this is an Israeli civilization. The experience of Palestinians would be that this is a Palestinian civilization. One version of the federation plan is taking Israel and including Area C into Israel, then taking Area A and B and dividing it into sort of 8 different cantons or 8 different sort of federal states, and having 2 branches of government. One branch of government would be the Knesset, which in itself has to change because clearly it's ineffective, but let's just say the Knesset. The second branch of government would be of the local cantons, and it would be a balance of power where one branch of government would have more local control, where each canton or each state would have more control over the region than the mayor of Tel Aviv has over Tel Aviv and the mayor of Haifa has over Haifa, but less national control. And it wouldn't be based on where you're living, on who you are, but where you're living. So if I as a Jew were to move to Hebron, I would be voting for that canton and for that state and no longer for the Knesset. And if a Palestinian were to move to Tel Aviv or somewhere within Israel proper, of what is Israel proper today, they would vote for the Knesset. And in that way, you're actually able to preserve the needs of the Jewish people, which we have a greater national need because we used to have a kingdom. We used to have this national control. And for Palestinians, what they really need and want is local control. And so fulfilling the needs of both peoples in a creative way that actually works for both. And we've never tried it that way. We've always tried it as it's us or them. And always I hear a lot of people, from my side as a Zionist, of saying, well, we've tried it with the Arabs, we've tried it with them. The PA and the PLO always rejected. The PA, the PLO, and Hamas do not represent Palestinians. They do not represent Palestinian interests. They never have. And every single solution that was offered was always a version of the two-state solution, which in my opinion is a disgrace and an insult to the collective cultures of both peoples. This land is not something that can just be divided. It's not a piece of territory or a piece of property. It is our soulmate. And there's the story of King David with the two mothers and the child, and he's able to find out who is the real mother of the child by saying, I'm going to cut the baby in half. One mother says, yes, cut it in half. Another mother says, no, it's actually not my baby. And the real mother was the mother that wasn't willing to cut their baby. So that's how I think we need to see the land. That's how the majority of Israelis see the land. That's how the majority of Palestinians see the land. So dividing us is an idea that was imposed by the United Nations and Britain to divide us through lines, which doesn't work for ethnic Middle Eastern and indigenous peoples. So there are many ways and theories, again, other than the Federation Plan. There are many versions of the Federation Plan, but that should give you some sort of new idea to sort of entertain, to kind of allow you to get out of the one state, two state paradigm. There's going to be something where it's one civilization that actually treats people with dignity and equal rights and fulfills the aspirations of both.
I have a question. So a lot of time in school and university settings, especially, a lot of anti-Semitic comments almost made as jokes. Like, for example, one person said to me, well, Hitler was good for the Jewish people. He gave them a home for 6 years of your life. And I didn't really know how to respond to that. So I was wondering what you would kind of suggest how to reply.
I mean, there's a little bit of a sad truth in there that if we didn't have anti-Semitism, we wouldn't have woken up and do something. But for someone to be insensitive and make a joke about that, or even mention the death of 6 million of our people as if it's something funny, is something that you need to call out. And you need to be able to speak to him or her and let them know why it's wrong. Be like, 6 million of my family members were killed, and you're just going to make a joke out of the person that did that, and try to relate something to them that they can understand. So for example, in a lot of liberal spaces, when they're talking about land rights and when I want people to understand why the Jewish people have a right to self-determination, I would say, well, don't you support the Tibetans and their return to Tibet, the Native Americans and Native Canadians and their land rights, the Maoris and their land rights, the Aboriginals and their land rights? So how come when it comes to the Jewish people, then all of a sudden there's this double standard? And you're trying to whitewash our history, to minimize our experiences, to delegitimize our identity, to demonize like who we are. So you basically call them out and show the hypocrisy and the double standard. So let's say this individual comes from a background where his people were persecuted somewhere else. You'd be like, what if someone made fun of you in that way? Wouldn't that be insensitive and racist and bad? So how come you do it to the Jewish people? So kind of put them in a situation that makes them think differently. And it's not necessarily the best approach to always get mad and fight back. We have to sort of use and channel the fire that we have to make the person, and even give a space for the person to realize their wrongs in a non-antagonistic way. And then if they keep going and saying all sorts of anti-Semitic stuff, then destroy them and post it online.
Hi, Rudy. I've got 2 questions for you. The first one is, how do you deal with people who try to whitewash our history? And the second is, as a British Jew, as a Labour British Jew, I see the rise in anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. How do we deal with the government and their anti-Semitism?
I'm writing your second question so I don't forget. So first of all, Jews are not white. And I say that because we need to understand first what white means. White doesn't necessarily mean a skin color. There are albino Africans that are lighter than some Caucasians and Europeans, and they're not considered white. There are very pale Asians, and they're not considered white. So white is not just skin color. It is origins and it is status. Origins being from Europe, and a status of being someone considered white in a white society. The origins of the Jewish people is not white, is not European. Even the Ashkenazi Jews, which don't make up all Jews, in Israel you have more Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews than Ashkenazi Jews, but even the Ashkenazi Jews, which sometimes could be the paler looking Jews, their genetic makeup is Middle Eastern from the Levant and is more closely related to Arabs in Saudi Arabia than it is to white Europeans. So genetically, culturally, historically, we are not from Europe. That's not our origins. That's not where our identity comes from. That's not where who we are comes from. It is just an experience. Number two, even during that experience, we were never considered white. We were always persecuted, whether it be blaming us for the death of Jesus, blaming us for the economic situation in Spain leading to the Spanish Inquisition, blaming us for the economic situation post-World War I leading to World War II and the Holocaust, being blamed for the Black Plagues, the pogroms, everything that is happening. We were always not the white man, not the white woman. We were always treated as not white. And even today, you go to college campuses, the only movement against the minority is against Jews. You go to New York City, which is a very Jewish city, right? 9% of the population is Jewish. Over 50% of the hate crimes are against Jews. You go to any white supremacist that actually believes in a white Aryan society. You ask them who target number one is. They'll tell you it's a Jew. So we're not white, not in our experience, not in our status, and not in our origins. And I think a lot of people try to frame the conversation that Jews are whites, not to talk about their skin color, but to say that we don't have a claim to Israel. Yeah,
I think it's also largely to do with assimilation. That my family came to Britain and they are seen as white people just going about their day. So I think that's a big part of it, is assimilation.
Yeah, so I think we need to go through a decolonization movement, not only decolonizing our land physically, but also decolonizing us mentally, psychologically. Decolonizing us not only physically, but mentally, psychologically, and even spiritually. You know, I look within Judaism, and even this idea that we have this division of Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform, which is a Christian concept. If you look in Christianity, those are the divisions in Christianity that was imposed onto Judaism that no other community other than Ashkenazi Jews had. And all of a sudden, this has become the norm, that we're dividing ourselves in these sort of classes. That to me is spiritual colonization of our culture. And we need to have a conversation now of decolonization, of being able to understand what is a Jew, who are we, where are we from, how are we supposed to live, and move past the trauma that we've dealt with for 2,000 years. So what you're talking about in the sense that Jews move to certain places and identify or start becoming like, I don't have a problem with Jews living in the diaspora physically, as long as they're not in the diaspora mentally. Meaning they should always know who they are and where they're from and where they always belong at some point. Because the reality is that long-term Jewish diaspora leads to Jewish death. Whether it's assimilation or a nation rising up against the Jewish people, it is a fact that the experience of Jews in the diaspora for the long term will lead to that. So as long as we know where we're from and where we need to go at some point back, I think it's fine. And to answer your question, we do need to go through a continuous decolonization process.
How would you suggest that we do
Just want to say, no. We're going to move to others. Sorry. We just have quite a few questions coming through, but thank you. Just a few things. We're going to have to end soon. So I don't know how much time Rudy has, but I know it's getting late by him as well. So just one or two things. First of all, someone wrote earlier, which I think would be great. And if people want to get a pen and paper, that might be useful. Rudy, someone asked on the chat resources that you would recommend people reading, just to clue themselves up on the facts. So maybe if you could just give some either sites, web, or books or things that you think are really informative and what will help people. So maybe you can say that, and if anyone wants to take some notes, that would be great.
Sure, I'll make it simple. First of all, I create a lot of videos explaining all these topics, and I'm in debates that give people the ability to see firsthand how people see things, how people react to things, how to dismantle anti-Semitic narratives. On a book list, send me a DM, and I'll send you a book list with a picture of all the books that I recommend. And then from there, you can look into which book is relevant for you.
That was easy. Okay. And the second question is, we had Douglas Murray on a few years ago. I don't know if you know him, but he said he was speaking in Shul, and he said, you're probably wondering why I'm talking to you guys. You're all Jewish, you're pro-Israel. What's the reason? He said, my main reason for speaking, he said, is I've noticed that Jews have this habit that whenever somebody brings up Israel, they first have a long, 2-minute throat clearing about Israel, saying, look, it is, I'm not saying that it's the best country, and I know the army does lots of bad things, and I'm not saying that all the policies are right, but we're the only democracy in the Middle East. And he says he wants to stop Jews having that whole throat clearing of all the excuses and all the things that they don't approve before they can say one positive thing about Israel. But to that end, somebody did write a question. How do you speak out against certain aspects of the Israeli government? You've touched on this a bit, without coming across as hating Israel or anti-Semitic, or still standing your ground. You know, after you've stood up for it, there are some things that might hurt, you know, you might not be on board with morally or emotionally.
Sure. I think it's a great question because a lot of people, especially on the anti-Jewish, anti-Israel side, will say, oh, well, any forms of criticism against the Israeli government, you guys deem as anti-Semitic. We all know that we don't know one Jew that doesn't criticize any sort of system that they're in. There's no Israeli that doesn't criticize the Israeli government, whether it's the right part of it, the left part of it, the leaders, those that have been leaders in the past. So this idea that you can't criticize the Israeli government or someone else is not true. You can't demonize, you can't delegitimize, you can't minimize, and you can't hold double standards. That's when you're not criticizing to uplift, you're trying to find ways to create political ammunition to attack us, to make us seem as the evil force, to make us seem as we don't have a right to live there, to apply a standard to everyone else, but not to us, or to minimize the reality and the experiences that we've been through. That's when it's not criticism, that's when it's anti-Semitism. Now, to be able to convince someone or speak to someone that is sort of like an anti-Zionist and get them to understand what is Zionism, I think the first thing that one must do in those conversations is first ask them, well, you define yourself as an anti-Zionist. What do you define as Zionism? And they will usually say anti-colonialism, anti-status quo, anti-conflict. And you tell them, well, if that's what Zionism meant, that you're against it, I would also be against it. But it just so happens to be that that's absolutely not what Zionism means. And actually in their answer, you can know where to fix the problem and where to address it. And you need to explain that Zionism is the right for the Jewish people to self-determine on their ancestral land. It has nothing to do with the conflict. It has nothing to do with Palestinians. It has to do with the idea that the Jews should have a right to come back to their homeland. That being said, in 1948, unfortunately, we fought an ethnic war of one people versus the other in a zero-sum game reality. The consequence of that war was displacement on both sides, and the consequence of the continuous wars and the continuous bad policies on both sides is the reality that exists today. Now, in order to criticize the Israeli government, I mean, for me, Israel has the power today. You look at the Palestinian Authority, and not only do they not represent the Palestinian people, but they're allowed to stay in power by the Israeli government. The Israeli government should be using its power to change the reality, to empower Palestinian voices, to allow freedom of speech. A lot of times when I do events with Palestinians in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank, I'm not allowed to post pictures with them, or if I post a picture, I have to blur out their faces because they don't have freedom of speech. If they normalize relations with Israelis or condemn something of the PA, they get arrested, they disappear for 2-3 weeks, they get tortured, their phones get stolen, their families get threatened. So we're living with a different sense of privilege and reality that a lot of Palestinians cannot do something to change this situation. So if I, as a Jew, were to live in Judea and Samaria and Israel was to protect me, why doesn't it protect Palestinians? Why doesn't it invest in the roads? Why doesn't it invest in infrastructure? Why doesn't it invest in being able to have access to cleaner water or to more electricity or to, like, we need to be investing more into this land. And this is not from a position of I'm liking the other side better. This is a position of we need to move forward. If this is our land and we have the power, we also have the responsibility to change the situation. And that doesn't mean we are the responsible ones for the situation. But now that we have the power and the dynamics favor us, we need to use that power to be able to move forward. So anyone who's criticizing or saying that criticizing the government is you guys are saying that that's anti-Semitic, show them how you criticize valid things of changing, and show them why certain ways of being not critical but anti-Semitic is actually not critical and truly anti-Semitic.
Beautiful, thank you. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll call the evening to an end. Just one of them is about people using anti-Semitic jokes or Holocaust jokes. I know you brought up a bit the Holocaust before with Raquel, but just conceptually, you're in school, someone makes some joke about the Holocaust. What is the response? What would you do?
You have to make it culturally unacceptable for those things to happen. And it's not something that can change with one action in one moment. Of course, like sometimes you have to, stand up for what you believe in and not let someone say that, and understand that there are social consequences to what you're going to say and you should defend yourself. But if we look at any other movements, let's say racism that still exists around the world, but let's say we go back 80 years ago where it was a lot more mainstream than it is today, and one were to make a joke about black people or do blackface or do things that were insensitive, that was accepted. How is it not accepted today? Because they invested in shifting the culture, shifting the younger generations, shifting in the perception and the climate for people to see things differently. And they worked and worked and worked, and they fought for the rights. And many people who fought for black rights died, including Jews. And eventually they were able to get there. So rights are not given, they are earned. And the Jewish people have not earned their rights and their respect. And if we want to start being respected, we have to start fighting for it and earning it. So you need to call those people out, you need to expose them, or you need to even start with something first, maybe before doing that, show them some compassion and go and speak to them and show them why it's wrong. They may not even know that it's wrong. They may be so oblivious to that reality. No one is born with hate. No one is born with darkness. It's something that is learned. So try to spread light where there is darkness. And if there's no way to do that, then expose them and make a social consequence to being anti-Semitic. If someone says something racist on campus, I can guarantee you they have no friends the next day. There's freedom of speech, and there should be freedom of reaction to speech. There would be freedom of reaction by the society to condemn this as something wrong. We need to move society towards a direction where they see the right things about the Jews as right and the wrong things about the Jews as wrong.
Thank you. That was amazing. And the last question says someone wrote on the group, when someone comes across an individual who's anti-Zionist, how do you prove? They say their information's correct. You say your information's correct. Obviously, very often these arguments are the spur of the moment. What is a tactic that you would use to be able to win the argument or be able to at least further the Israeli cause?
So you first break down, like I said before, the terminology and understanding what they define it as to understand where the problem is. And then you explain to them what you define it as and make it clear that what's most important is what you're actually meaning and not how you're defining it differently, and show them that you probably don't have such a different worldview. And then you explain to them it's not the job of those that aren't Zionist and aren't Jews to define what being Jewish or Zionist is. It's not the job of people that aren't Palestinians to tell what a Palestinian is, or people that aren't black to tell a black person what being a black person is. It's up to those identities to define it. So if you apply the standard to all people, but when it comes to Jews, they can't define their own movements, they can't define their own identity, you're holding a double standard and you're anti-Semitic. So maybe you should listen to Jewish voices for once and hear what we mean by this. And you'll talk to any and every Jew. Zionism means the right for the Jewish people to self-determine in their ancestral land, and it has always meant that. That doesn't mean there aren't strands of Zionism, right-wing, left-wing, religious, not religious. There are strands of Zionism, there's strands of Palestinian identity, there's strands and branches of black identity, and people have their own individuality and their own other layers of identity that can exist. But the core idea of Zionism is the right for the Jewish people to self-determine. And if you're for all indigenous peoples to self-determine, but against the Jewish people's right to self-determine, then you're anti-Semitic.
Wow, thank you very, very much, Rudy. That was an amazing talk. The way you handled every single question was, we all wish we could have those words at the time when it's posed to us. And so often we're stuck without the right words to say. But thank you so much for your time. And thank you everybody for joining. And as I said in the beginning, I hope we can have a little bit of Rudy in all of us, the courage, the determination, the grit to be able to stand up. It's tough sometimes to take an unpopular position, but being Jewish has always meant, Ivri, that you might be on the other side of the river, but you could be a trailblazer like Abraham and absolutely transform the world if you're willing to give enough effort. So thank you so, so much.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to end it, and God bless you all. And thank you, Gabrielle, again. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.